Marvel Snap has a pretty big problem, and it all boils down to tech cards. But it's not the ones you're thinking of. Let's talk about it. Alright, so this all kind of spawned together when I saw this tweet from this guy here, Robert Ubedi. I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. I'm a little rusty on, I think that would be Swedish. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It could be German. But yeah, Ubedi, I'm pretty sure is how you pronounce that last name. But anyway, if you're watching this, Robert, let me know if I'm wrong. Made this tweet saying they got to Infinite in about 130 with Silver Surfer. And there was one thing they said in this tweet that made me wonder. They said Shadow King is in a wonderful spot in the meta right now. Now, I don't disagree. I think Shadow King's in a really cool spot with the introduction of Kitty Pryde to pretty much all players. That kind of deck's being played quite a bit with things like Bast, the Collector, and different cards that are going to go ahead and inflate their power with things like Angela, like I said, the Collector already. Kitty Pryde's going to get their own power inflated as well. And Shadow King does a great job in dealing with cards of that nature. And it's not just bounce and things like that. It's pretty much any deck that's going to be running these type of cards that allow to have different inflation. Silver Surfer is another example. And it made me think back when Silver Surfer was dominant alongside Zabu in that unfortunate meta back in, January? Shadow King maybe could have been something that players could have used to help combat Silver Surfer. Now, am I saying Silver Surfer would not need to get, nerfed in that situation anyway? No, I'm not saying that. It very well could have been still needed of a nerf, but giving players the proper tools to actually utilize the tech cards available in the game of Snap to pretty much cover all their corners, all their bases, would go a long way and maybe could have resulted in Surfer not needing a nerf. I think he probably still would have needed it in the long run, but it is just an example. The problem with that, though, is the fact that Shadow King was locked behind Series 5, and at the time was a 4-3, and was deemed to be a fairly weak-looking card overall, which was kind of proven by the fact that they did eventually buff him to be a 3-3. It wasn't a card that people were hyped about. It wasn't a card people were excited about, so no one really wanted to spend the 6,000 tokens, even a lot of content creators, to just try him out, because it was a very simple type of mechanic that he utilized, an ability that he utilized where you felt like maybe Shang-Chi would have been better or Enchantress would have been better, especially because people were like, he can't hit ongoing stuff. So this problem is going to be exacerbated a little bit as we move forward, especially with looking at the most recent leaks and data mines. There's two cards I want to talk about primarily that fall into this tech card category that are going to actually make a problem for Marvel Snap, and I'm worried we're going to see more unnecessary bans or unnecessary nerfs, I should say, that result from players not having the appropriate tools given to them at their disposal fast enough. And of course, yes, this is technically a card acquisition problem in that type of video, so if you're not wanting to look at this kind of thing, I'm sorry. But this is a big issue in Marvel Snap, and it will continue to be an issue, and it's not just affecting the players' morale and their ability to want to play the game, their motivation to want to play the game. We've seen a lot of players just quit because they're not getting cards fast enough, and they're frankly getting bored of it. One example is a very prominent player within the Magic community, Brian Kibler. He's a huge advocate for any card game he takes a part of. And if Marvel Snap were able to get him as a content creator, that'd be pretty cool. But unfortunately, he quit the game pretty fast because he said card acquisition was too slow. And that's just one example. So I don't want to see cards get nerfed in the future just because we don't have the proper ways to combat them. And it's not that we don't have those ways, it's that they're inaccessible to the average person. Two cards coming out in this data mined and leak that we saw recently are going to be Jean Grey and Echo. Now, Jean Grey is a 3-3 that says ongoing, players must play their first card here if able. So it's like a Morag on a body, or as we call it in Magic, on a stick. This is a really interesting way to combat decks that want to just go ahead and say, I'm looking to curve out. Like you're most likely going to see with a Devil Dino Darkhawk type of deck and things like that. Usually those decks don't want to play multiple cards in the same turn until you get around turns 5 and 6. Primarily turn 6 with the thanks to Zabu, making sure your 4 costs are 3 each. That's usually what you end up seeing. Oftentimes they will go a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and then maybe a 2 and a 3 on 5, most likely a 5 with something like Devil Dino, and of course a couple of 4s on 6. But any deck that relies on that type of gameplay is going to be pretty much SOL when it comes down to facing off against Jean Grey. And that is a great tool to combat a lot of these decks that typically call themselves good stuff decks. Good stuff decks are just a compilation of cards that are deemed to be good on stats and have some type of flexibility or ways to affect the game state in a positive manner that isn't entirely dependent on synergies. Good stuff decks often like to just curve out. This would be a nice way to combat good stuff decks, and then you, on the other hand, could be the person playing Jean Grey in something like a Kitty Pryde deck. This is pretty nice, and it's a really cool tech card for these type of decks if we don't want them to get out of hand. One problem though, it's gonna be a Series 5 card. And what happens in a world where people deem Darkhawk to be too good in this type of good cards deck? Because Jean Grey isn't available to the masses to actually full stop it, at least enough to make it so its meta share is a little bit less, its win rate is less because it has a great counterpart going around in the meta. But if people aren't playing with Jean Grey because they can't access her, then maybe that deck runs wild, they nerf them, and then Jean Grey becomes available, and then people realize, holy shit, this was really good against a Darkhawk style deck. Another one I'm really interested in, and one that's going to be really impactful, I think, is Echo, a 1/2 that says whenever your opponent plays an ongoing card here, remove its abilities. This is an insane card. And there's one application I've been seeing in my mind that no one else has talked about. But let's talk about the first things first. Right? So we have Cosmo is a great thing to basically turn off for that. You go Echo in a lane that you wanted to do some reveal stuff. Maybe you were setting up a Wong or a Rock Slide or something like that. Something you really want to get off the on reveals, and you don't want your opponent to go Cosmo. Destroy is another good example for this, because it turns off Cosmo and Armor for a lane and protects that lane for destroy effects. Now, of course, you end up destroying the Echo in the process, but guaranteeing a hit on your Bucky and a Carnage to get your 10 power or whatever there is pretty impactful in the long run to just make sure that your opponent is dissuaded from disrupting you. That's a pretty cool thing. Otherwise, it also forces your opponent to play into other lanes for their Devil Dinos, their Darkhawks, all these ongoing cards that present huge problems within the meta, or at least problems for a lot of decks that aren't running particular tech cards. Now, this works great in tandem with other existing tech cards like Shang-Chi and Enchantress, because now you're basically pigeonholing your opponent to say, you can't play your card here, so you have to play in one of these other 2 lanes. And then with other card manipulation or lane manipulation, it might not be too hard to actually force them to go into a lane you really want them to, in a singular lane, with things like Professor X, Storm, things like that. And then that pretty much leaves them wide open for a Shang-Chi or an Enchantress to ruin their day, or they're overcommitted to that one lane anyway, and it allows you to focus your power in the other 2 according lanes. Echo is a really cool, flexible card that I think is going to be very impactful in the meta. But people aren't going to have her. The other thing I was talking about, in what I haven't seen anyone mention, is Echo is a really interesting tech card against Galactus. One problem that Galactus has in the meta for most people when it comes to the way that the game is designed, of course, is the fact that it fundamentally changes the way that Marvel Snap is played. Well, when you get down to that final turn 6, typically you're dreading the opponent to have a null. Of course, yes, they can do the death thing and just like Nimrod into Wolverine and basically have them bounce the other lane, but the most typical way that people will lose is a null or in combination with death as well. I really do think, based on the way it's worded, It's similar to Negasonic Teenage Warhead. Also, another interesting tech card that could have been something to help stop other decks in the past, but I digress. It's similarly worded to Negasonic Teenage Warhead, and it says, after a card is played. Now, typically the way that it works in Marvel Snap is the term after played is not the initial coming down onto the board, it's actually the moment a card flips up. So, in the case of Galactus, if they're going to play a null, most likely you, unfortunately, are going to have priority. In this case, you could go ahead and play Echo. She will flip because you have priority. Their null will flip. It disables their null, and that could be the difference in winning and losing against Galactus. Now, I do think you should probably just still retreat against Galactus in those situations regardless, but this is a nice, interesting way of a gotcha if it indeed works in this manner. I do think it will. It's worded similarly to Negasonic Teenage Warhead, like I said, so I do think that is how it will work. It also presents an interesting idea of a pseudo Guardians tech card, essentially. Not against Guardians, but it's in the same vein of how they function. It's a gotcha moment. I gotta call my shot on turn 6, play it, I have priority, hopefully I snipe your Darkhawk or your Devil Dino, or maybe both if you're overcommitting to a lane for some reason. It's very cool. Again, the problem lies within players will not have these cards. I'm going to say it again. Players will not have these cards. Not in time, at least. Now, we do see some things from the previous announcement of this most recent patch that do maybe help this issue. They're saying that they're looking at releasing cards directly into Series 4. They're also looking at, when it comes to series drops, some cards might go straight from 5 to 3 because they want more players to have them. This is a nice start. Still, within the way that timelines work in Marvel Snap, it very well could result in unnecessary nerfs of cards before cards have the chance to reach the hands of players in more accessible tiers such as Series 4 and Series 3. I still think that's an issue. If we're going to go as far as saying maybe we can drop from 5 to 3 within a month of release, or maybe go straight into 4, why not go straight into 3 for plenty of cards? Snowguard's a great example, a very interesting niche card that seems to have no play whatsoever and is ultimately deemed pretty weak within the meta. People aren't really going to play her because she's Series 5. However, if she was Series 3, forget going to 4, go straight to 3 on release. People would be able to have her, kind of mess around with her, see how she works, and then that would be nice for the game. She'd still ultimately most likely be deemed very weak, but at least people have her, right? And that's very important when it comes to these tech cards. Jean Grey, Echo, Shadow King when he was released. These would have been amazing. I think Stegron is another one that seems pretty solid. Juggernaut, I've always felt, is one of the most underplayed and underappreciated cards in Marvel Snap, and Stegron feels very similar in that manner, especially with the way it can kind of work off of Zabu. Unfortunately, you see where I'm going with this? Say it with me. Come on, class. No one will have the card because it's Series 5. This is a problem. It's a problem. And I get it when it comes to High Evolutionary. You know, that's a card coming out in like a day or two. And it's a big bad. It's whatever. It's very flashy. It gives you 7 new cards, all this shit. Cool. It is a fun card to play with. I don't think it's an integral part of the game. I would say Jeff is also an integral part of the game. One of the best cards released that seems at face value to be not that important or not that great. It's not flashy. By the way, again, I called it. But Jeff is awesome. And is also a card that should be available to players in Series 3. We got to stop dicking around with this Series 5, Series 4 bullshit, because that's what it is. And don't even get me started on the announcement within that patch where I was praising some things of the series drop and things like that. There's already some issues with people complaining that Null and Darkhawk stayed in Series 4 and didn't drop when people expected them to, as well as them saying if they feel that the meta is healthy, they may just flat out skip a series drop for a month if they feel so. Don't do that. Don't do that. I already talked about it on my podcast with Chris over on his channel, Snap on Ego, and I kind of dove into that pretty aggressively there. I'm not going to do it here. Long story short, bad idea. Don't do it second dinner. But more importantly, give players cards that matter in counteracting cards within the meta. Big bads, cards that are very flashy, cards that do things on their own, like Iron Lad, are going to be fine in my mind at Series 4. Notice how I didn't say Series 5. I think Series 5 should be reserved for big bads only, and every card coming out in Marvel Snap should start in Series 4 unless they are signified to be a big bad like Galactus, Thanos, Kang, and now High Evolutionary. Otherwise, put the tech cards in Series 3. Howard should be in Series 3. Jeff should be in Series 3. Shadow King should have been Series 3. Echo, Jean Grey, Series 3. But let me know what you guys think. Is this a problem in Marvel Snap in the long run? Is this potentially making some of you play the game less? Is it making you want to quit Marvel Snap? I don't like making these videos in a really negative light. I think this is very good constructive criticism for Second Dinner. And, you know, being a part of the creator program, I'm able to actually voice these concerns within the Second Dinner Discord as well, or at least the creator program Discord, whatever. I can talk to people essentially now, which is kind of cool. I hope they listen to me on this one, or at least take more steps to the future. We don't need unnecessary nerfs for cards that could have been held at bay thanks to tech cards that were unfortunately unavailable to people at the time. Make them available. Make big bads the only things that cost 5,000. Make cards that can do things on their own, like a Darkhawk, like a, Null, or anything that pretty much functions on its own or can basically propel a deck upward. Make those Series 4 and then eventually drop them in Series 3. That's fine. But make your tech cards Series 3 always. It'll make the game so much better. It'll increase the health of the game overall. The meta will be fantastic, having basically ways to counteract every single deck at any given time. And by the way, please give us a best of 3 format with sideboards to actually show off the fact that you are a skilled player when it comes to Marvel Snap and not just reliant on RNG and luck. That's all. That's it for me. Let me know what you guys think. I appreciate you. You guys are the best, and I will talk to you on the next one.